In Chapter 9, we will be talking about a cognitive psychology topic called knowledge. As you can see, there is a lot to cover in this module. It basically deals with how we place objects into categories. We will talk about different levels of categories, how we represent relationships between categories, how we represent concepts in networks, and then something that I will focus on in this lecture, which is how we represent those concepts in the brain. And we will take a look at some different approaches and some hypotheses about how we go about representing those concepts in the brain. So first, let's take a look at what do cognitive psychologists mean by knowledge. Specifically, they focus on conceptual knowledge, and this is knowledge that enables us to recognize objects and events so that we can make inferences about their properties. The knowledge exists in the form of concepts, and concepts are simply mental representations of those categories that we use for a variety of cognitive functions, many of which at this point we have already talked about. So a good question to ask at this point is, how are all of these things organized? Well, it turns out that we categorize. Cognitive psychologists define categorization as the process by which things are placed into groups called categories. And categories are all possible examples of a particular concept. You might be wondering, why are categories useful? Cognitively speaking, why do we need categories? Well, and it turns out that we use categories. Our brain naturally uses it. Our cognitive system naturally uses categories because they are very useful. For example, they help us to understand individual cases that are not previously encountered. So for example, if we have a case that has similar features to a category that already exists in our brain, then we might consider and have good evidence to put that individual case that we have not previously encountered in this particular category. These are often called pointers to knowledge. And that's because categories provide a lot of information, a lot of general information about a particular item. But they also allow us to identify the special characteristics of a particular item. So, taking a look at this first point, right, we have a lot of information about a particular item. And if you think about the picture of the cat that appeared in that textbook, we know that most cats have whiskers, that they sleep a lot except in the evening, that they purr, and that they meow, and lots of other things, all right? And so just knowing that an object is a cat gives us this wealth of information, but also allows us to identify the special characteristics of that particular item. And so we know that some of those characteristics of a cat, such as that cat's meow, allow us to distinguish them from similar items but that are not in that category. For example, we would not put a dog in the category of a cat because a dog barks and doesn't meow. All right, let's take a look at different categories in the brain. And so now I want to kind of shift focus and talk about how we represent these categories in the brain. Different areas of the brain may be specialized to process information about different categories. So let's take a look at this by first looking at studies of brain damaged individuals. Brain damaged patients can tell us a lot about the functions of the brain, and then we'll look at studies of brain imaging of normal subjects. So let's consider patients KC and patient EW, both of whom had category-specific memory impairment. Right, so remember that category-specific memory impairment. This occurs when we lose the ability to identify one type of object, but retain the ability to identify other objects. It turns out that KC and EW could identify non-animals, but were unable to identify animals. And so if you take a look at the results of this study, all right, notice that both of them did pretty well when asked to identify non-animals, so non-living things like fruits, vegetables, furniture. But when they were asked to identify animals, both of them were able to do so to a certain extent, but their ability to do so was clearly impaired, and that's because they had category-specific memory impairment. Right? Why does this happen? Why are they able to categorize non-animals but unable to categorize living animals? It turns out that living things are distinguished by sensory properties. And objects such as non-living animals or non-living things are identified by functional properties. This study alone led to what was called the sensory functional hypothesis, which basically states that our semantic memory system can distinguish sensory attributes from functional attributes. Let's take a look at another way in which we can represent categories in the brain. The sensory category approach proposes that we have specific neural circuits in the brain for specific categories. And that suggests that there are specific areas of the brain that respond to specific stimuli. And this is something that we talked about to a certain extent in Chapter 2. Another approach is called the multiple factors approach. And this approach looks at how concepts are divided up within a category rather than identifying what specific areas of the brain have networks for different concepts. This is one way in which we can differentiate different concepts. Another way that we can differentiate different concepts is something called crowding. And this occurs when we have different concepts within a category that share many properties. For example, consider animals. They all have a lot of the same properties. They have eyes, they have legs, they have the ability to move. Crowding enables us to differentiate animals because they have these characteristics from artifacts. So things like potatoes. Actually, potatoes do have eyes and legs, but they don't have the ability to move. Or think about apples, right? Or fruit, a general category. They do not have these properties. Another approach looks at the number of factors that are involved in telling the difference between different objects. This is known as the embodied approach. According to the embodied approach, our knowledge of concepts is based on the reactivation of sensory and motor processes, and keep in mind that these are some of the things that distinguish between living animals and artifacts or objects. Anyway, the embodied approach suggests that our knowledge of concepts is based on the reactivation of sensory and motor processes that occur when we interact with the object, right? And that's the key here to the embodied approach, is this interaction. For example, everything we know about mirror neurons, and you will spend time in this module doing activities related to mirror neurons. But mirror neurons are those things that fire when we do a task or when we observe another person doing that same task. So it turns out that we have neurons in our brain that will fire when we are cooking an egg, for example. But amazingly, if we are watching somebody else cook an egg, those same exact neurons will fire, and that's known as mirror neurons. So this is yet another approach that helps us to understand how we represent these different categories in our brain.